Hey, Lark and Rose. So we have this big IRS scandal that's in all the news about the fact that the IRS got caught giving extra scrutiny to groups that have like Patriot or Tea Party in their name, conservative groups that are applying for tax-exempt status. And a few people mentioned it to me and said, yay, look, the media is finally pointing out how nasty the IRS is. Sorry, but I have a different take. This scandal, this breaking story, to me, is about the same as saying, this just in, Adolf Hitler was caught jaywalking. If you think this stupid little trivial thing of, oh, they looked a little bit more at certain people applying for tax-exempt status, if you think that's the bad thing that the IRS does that's worth making a national news story about, you don't know anything about the IRS. And the media, this may even be one of those times when the control freaks, they leak a little trivial government abuse to make it look like, oh, don't worry, we're keeping an eye out for government when it gets out of line. This is so pathetically, irrelevantly lame compared to things I've seen the IRS do myself. And going on for years and years and against a lot of different people. And so the idea that, oh, they looked a little bit harder at certain applications for tax-exempt status, really? That's the main horror story of the IRS? I've had 12 of those Nazi bastards do an armed invasion of my house because I said stuff they didn't like. And I'm not exaggerating. They, back in May of 2003, a dozen or so IRS fascists did an armed invasion of my house based on a search warrant. It took me a year and a half to get it unsealed. They wanted it kept secret. And I wanted to show the world, I want you guys to show the world the document that made it okay for you to invade my house. So after a year and a half of legal stuff, I finally got that unsealed and made it public. It was basically a list of the fact that I say what I think, and I show my legal conclusions having looked into the IRS laws and what they actually say. Literally, this search warrant, which was the excuse for them to do an armed invasion of my home, scare the heck out of my daughter, who was like 5 at the time. Their excuse for doing that, their affidavit of probable cause, the search warrant, literally did not allege the existence of any evidence they didn't already have. In fact, it went through how I do these things in public. I tell the IRS about them. I tell them what I'm doing. I told them what I was doing back then, and I was perfectly open about my conclusions. Their own request for a search warrant made all of that obvious. Who applies for a search warrant without citing any evidence of what they're looking for? It's not like, a search warrant is supposed to be something like, well, here's our probable cause to think this guy stole something or murdered somebody, and here's the evidence that we think is in this place. They didn't mention evidence. They just did an armed invasion, mainly to steal a video I made called Theft by Deception, which they've never alleged that it's illegal. There's no injunction against it. There's nothing illegal about it. They just didn't like that I said it. So when I turn on the news and, oh my gosh, they looked a little bit harder at the application for tax-exempt status, that's the story? The bastards did an armed invasion of my house for saying perfectly legal stuff that they admit is legal. And so it's just amazing to me. And, that's one little example. A lot of people have gotten it a lot worse than I did. But I was put on trial, and the IRS witnesses lied under oath. The prosecutor lied under oath. The judge lied and broke the law. The prosecutor and the IRS broke the law all over the place. They committed perjury in their application for a search warrant and in their testimony in court, which I can prove, and I do prove. I have an ebook of this called Kicking the Dragon, which tells my whole story. Now, anybody who's familiar with what I went through, and again, a lot of people have had it a lot worse than I did with an extortion racket known as the IRS, but even just my story, which ended up with me in a cage for a little over a year, and being robbed into poverty by these crooks, anybody who's familiar with that story has got to look at the story that's in the media today and think, really? That's what you caught the IRS doing? That's the big story? These are completely lawless, armed thugs and thieves. And for this to be the story is just kind of funny. It's just lame. And somebody I know down in Texas who his horrible sin, and the government was very open about this, his horrible sin was providing the funding so I could make my video Theft by Deception, which talks about the federal income tax. For that sin, he had his home invaded by armed fascists, and he was prosecuted, and he was robbed, and they eventually stole his house and impoverished him and stuck him in a cage for even longer than they did for me, because he funded a perfectly legal video, which they admit is perfectly legal. And so, just blatant fascist armed home invasions. So when you come out and say, gosh, the IRS got caught looking at some applications for tax-exempt status a little more carefully. Really? There are lots of people who have dealt with the IRS personally who realize what they are. They don't care about their rules. They don't care about the law. They don't care about the truth. They're just, I would say they're the mafia, but that would literally be an insult to the mafia. I'm not kidding at all with that. The mafia is far more deserving of respect than the IRS. They're more predictable. They're more honorable. They're very clear about what they want. The IRS is a bunch of slimy little conniving crooks, none of whom has the spine to take responsibility for what they do. None of them know anything about the law or their own procedures. None of them care about any of that. They all lie constantly. In my trial, I had IRS agents totally lying under oath. Bald-faced lies, which are easy to prove. And again, my ebook, Kicking the Dragon, goes through it, quotes them. It shows reality, it shows them lying. Nothing ever happens to them. And that's, I have to mention that about, this hearing of congressmen really taking to task the IRS. Come on, people. This is a show they put on. The IRS is the attack dog for Congress. You really think Congress doesn't approve of them being vicious, extortionist psychos? That's what they're there for. They steal like $2 trillion a year. They have to be vicious and evil and psychotic to keep up the extortion racket, and Congress loves it. But then they put on these stupid shows of, we're very concerned about the way the IRS has been treating taxpayers. No, they're not. Nobody in Congress gives a crap about you. And I can point to a dozen different cases where people wrote to their congressman and said, look, here's what I'm doing. I've been open and honest, and the IRS lied about this, and they stole that, and they won't meet with me, and they skipped all due process. If you're on the IRS's enemies list, you know what they're really like. Because they literally have an enemies list. And this came out in testimony before Congress, which resulted in the IRS Restructuring and Reform Act of 1998, which is meaningless, and the IRS ignores it. TIGTA, the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration, knows they ignore it. TIGTA releases reports every year to say how much the IRS is ignoring the law. Nothing happens. Nobody gets fired. Nobody gets prosecuted. They can do anything they want. Congress doesn't care. Now, Congress puts on a show that they pretend they care so that you'll be stupid enough to vote for them next time around. So these congressmen pretending to be outraged, complete freaking lie. These are armed, mindless, brainless thug thieves. And a lot of people have learned that the hard way. And it's just, I just can't stomach this being the story. This looking into applications, that's what they should be condemned for. I mean, that's bad. And it's kind of funny that Obama's out there pretending, oh, if they did that, we'll have to look in, as if it wasn't his idea. Come on, people, how stupid are you? You think the IRS sits around going, let's, just for the fun of it, go harass the political opponents of our boss? Like he had nothing to do. It's just Nixon all over again. It's an attack dog, so he sends it after the people he doesn't like. I mean, to think that wouldn't happen is just silly. And when Congress goes, oh, we're very concerned. No, they're not. If anything, they're concerned that they aren't holding the leash of the attack dog. The other set of crooks is right now. So it's just ridiculous. And, I mean, this is public record. The IRS has their own enemies list. Anybody who publicly speaks out about the income tax or has come to conclusions about the income tax laws that don't match conventional wisdom. And there's a bunch of people who have conclusions that I think are legally wrong. You know, I think these people misread something, misunderstood something, but the way they get treated by the IRS is completely fascist. I mean, the IRS literally has a code, and you can look this up. This came up in testimony. Congress outlawed it, and they still do it. Takedown knows they still do it and does reports. They have a code. It used to be illegal tax protester, which means don't give this person any due process. And they've done this to me. They've done this to other people I know. Skip all due process. Don't give them any hearings. Don't give them any rights at all. Never give them any chance to say a word about anything, anywhere. Go right to stealing their stuff as fast as you can. Just make stuff up. And in my case, they literally just made stuff up out of thin air, and I have other videos about it. It's just silly that this is what they got caught doing. This is nothing compared to what they do to thousands of people across the country, wiping out bank accounts with no due process. I mean, none. I mean, the IRS doesn't even say, here are our findings, we want to audit you. They say, you don't get to say anything. We're not going to talk to you. We're just going to steal your money. We're going to go all the way to a levy with nothing in between. And their publications say, well, you're supposed to get a meeting, and you can write a letter, and you can record it, and you can explain your position, and then you can have a neutral appeals officer look over the case and say, none of that happens if you're on their enemies list. I mean, they literally, blatantly violate the law as obviously as you possibly could, just as if a cop shows up to your house and says, give me $50,000. And you say, for what? And he says, I don't have to tell you for what. Give me $50,000. That's the IRS. So when they say, oh my gosh, look, they got caught paying a little bit extra attention to, it's just ridiculous. And they do this against anybody who is publicly, openly, and honest about, saying things the IRS doesn't want to say, including their own. Sherry Peel Jackson used to be IRS, and when she came out and said, wow, I always, I did my job as an IRS agent thinking I was upholding the law and all that, and then I heard about these things and started to look into them and started to question stuff, and she goes to her superiors and say, I'm wondering about this, and they say, shut up. What? And long story, they eventually throw her in a cage for not towing the line, for saying, I think something really is wrong here. All you other IRS agents, I think, you may be trying to be the good guy, but something is horribly amiss here about what the laws actually say. And so they just vindictively went after her and stuck her in a cage. And you're telling me that the story is they look a little bit at these applications like that's the bad thing about the IRS? Joe Bannister, another guy who used to be IRS. And then he was Criminal Investigation Division. And then he started hearing things and said, wow, these actually sound like reasonable questions from these tax protesters, people who get labeled tax protesters. And he said, well, shouldn't we be able to answer their questions? If we're going to huff and puff and take their stuff and arrest them and stuff, maybe the first thing we should do is show them where they're wrong or answer their questions. And again, his superiors basically say, shut up, and eventually said, you're going to resign, which means you're fired. And then they tried to prosecute him. They lost in that case, but they never stopped harassing people on their enemies list. And so again, it's silly that this is the story that people think, oh my gosh. So I want to make this deal. My ebook, Kicking the Dragon, it's a long story because it quotes what actually happened. It quotes from the trial. It quotes from the IRS letters and my letters. It quotes from the meetings I had with them, which were recorded. The whole ridiculous story is all in there. And the ebook is a whole $5. Whoopee-doo. But here's what I'll do. If you promise to actually read the story, and some of it is just unbelievably uncomfortable because it's just, you won't believe how horrendously lawless and evil these bastards are. I'll make this deal for, let's say, the next week from when I post this video. If you promise me you'll read it, I'll send you the ebook of Kicking the Dragon for free. Because anybody who reads that story and sees what they actually do to the people on the IRS's enemies list, and again, a lot of people got it worse than me. I was only in a cage for a year. They do 3 years, 5. So, Irwin Schiff, just about gave him a death sentence for disagreeing. Now, I disagree with some of Irwin Schiff's legal theories, but I wouldn't cage him for the rest of his life for something he obviously believes in. And their whole tactic is just fascist. And they do public slandering, and all they have to do is say, "You're a frivolous tax protester." When you say, "Wait a minute, I found this in your law books, I'm wondering what it means." And so, like I said in my story, it gives transcripts of the meetings I had with the IRS where I sat down with them and said, "Well, look what it says. Like, I'm not hiding anything." They admitted I'm not hiding anything. I'm just looking what it says. And they say, "Oh, we're not really familiar with this. We see why you believe that. We'll get back to you." And by "we'll get back to you," they meant we'll send a dozen armed fascists to barge into your house in a couple of years. Because that's how they got back to me. So, yeah, so my deal is basically anybody who promises to read the story, and it's a pretty long story, that's why it's out of print, is because it's huge. It's a 488-page book when it's printed this big, although a bunch of that is appendices and the legal motions and stuff. But anybody who promises to read the story, I'll send them a free ebook of it, and you'll see why I think it's so funny that this is what they expose as the big IRS scandal. It's Hitler caught jaywalking. It's just, I don't know if it's funny or sad, but if you learn what the IRS really is, and Congress loves it, you know, all the people who wrote to their congressmen saying, "Look at what they're doing," Congress never helped. They said, "Yeah, sorry, we can't handle that. You'll have to talk to the IRS directly." Literally hundreds of people wrote to their congressmen and said, I see this in the law, I have these questions, nobody will answer it. Everybody in Congress runs the other way. We're not going to talk about that. And then they pass laws to punish people for asking for due process, like Rick Santorum, you fascist Nazi bastard, who pushed through a penalty to steal lots of your money if you ask for due process from the IRS. And I'm not kidding. If you ask for due process and want to discuss a legal issue that they don't want to talk about, all they have to do is assert that it's frivolous. They don't have to prove it's frivolous. They don't have to prove anything. If they say that, then they can say, "You have to take back your request for a meeting or we're going to fine you $5,000. I'm not kidding. This is what Congress is doing. So when they go out there and say, "We're outraged," and behind closed doors they say, "Yeah, let the IRS steal $5,000 from you if you ask for a meeting." You know, forget the show. See what's really happening. So anybody who wants to read it for the next week, I'm going to give away for free Kicking the Dragon ebook. Subtitle is Confessions of a Tax Heretic. To actually see what the IRS is like, because to say that this is the big scandal with those just lawless evil crooks is just funny.